Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I know folks are still entering into this webinar. My name is Raj Reddy, and as co-chair of the International Subcommittee of the ABA TIPS Animal Law Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this International Animal Law Speaker Series event. If you aren't yet part of this subcommittee and would like to join, please submit your name and email using the Q&A function, asking to be added, and I can follow up with details on our first meeting of the new bar year. With that said, I'm pleased to kick off this webinar, Peril and Progress, Pushing the Boundaries of International Animal Transport Laws in the US, Ukraine, and Beyond. Our distinguished speakers are Cynthia von Schlichten, Rebecca Critser, and Hanna Tereshko, who will be addressing international animal transport laws in the areas of agriculture, research, and war, respectively. I'll be introducing each briefly in turn with a note that you can find their fuller bios on our registration page. As they present, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as we can after all three have presented. So first up, we have Cynthia von Schlichten, an animal law LLM candidate at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. Cynthia is interim general counsel for Farm Sanctuary. She's also a member of the ABA Agricultural and International Animal Law Subcommittees, the latter of which she is a co-chair of. In her talk, Cynthia will call attention to how nearly 2 billion animals are slaughtered for food in North America every year, with most of these animals transported over lengthy and harrowing journeys riddled with deplorable conditions, including inadequate food, water, and space, not to mention extreme temperatures, conditions that result in distress, disease, injury, and even death. The US, Canada, and Mexico have all significantly different requirements with regard to transport and slaughter laws. Requirements within each country can vary based on the country of departure and destination, and the species being transported and the method of transport. And delving into this complex landscape, Cynthia will provide an overview of farm to animal transport laws, address their inconsistencies, as well as issues with enforcement and oversight. And with a close close with the call to action to unify the requirements throughout North America in an effort to improve animal welfare and industry accountability. Thank you so much for joining us, Cynthia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Yeah? Okay, great. So, hi, everyone. Today I'm going to...
Cynthia, I think we're seeing just your, we're not seeing your shared, if you're in share mode or if you're in presentation mode, we're not seeing the presentation. We're just seeing the outline part.
Oh, you can't see the slide?
We can see the slide, but it's not in presentation mode. If you want to go into presentation mode, or if you have it on a different screen. But this is fine right now.
Yeah, I think I have to leave it the way it is. It's a little quirky, so I apologize for that. So hello, everyone. Today I'm going to sort of scratch the surface on live farmed animal transport in North America, largely talking about North America, but I'm also going to briefly address the EU just sort of for comparison's sake. And I say scratching the surface for two reasons. One, because this is a pretty short presentation and these are pretty involved topics that I could probably talk for hours on each country, but also because I feel like these laws really only scratch the surface on what is necessary for proper welfare for these animals in these transportation situations. And I also want to add, just along the scratching the surface lines, is that horses have a different set of rules for a lot of these countries and the applicable laws. So for purposes of today, I'm not going to delve into laws about horses. In North America alone, more than 10 billion land animals are slaughtered each year. And most of these animals have to be transported from where they're raised to where they're slaughtered. It's not a one-stop shop. And sometimes that transport is short, just a few minutes, but sometimes it's hours or even days. In the US alone, 25 billion animals are slaughtered for food every day. And there is only one federal law that addresses the conditions of these animals. That is the 28-hour law. The 28-hour law is a federal law that addresses the transportation of animals used for food or food production across state lines. Essentially, the 28-hour law says that animals can travel for 28 consecutive hours before they are required to be offloaded and provided with food, water, and rest for 5 hours before they can get back on the truck again. Note that when this law was enacted, they were really talking about rail carrier. Everything was done by train. But obviously, for decades now, most of this is being done by trucks. However, it took till 2006 for the government to acknowledge that the 28-hour law should be also finding the transportation that is done by motor carrier or truck. So, flaws in the laws, there are a lot of them, but these are the highlights. Approximately 9 billion birds are slaughtered each year for food in the US, and birds are not protected by the 28-hour law. It also does not apply to the transport that is any destination other than a slaughter facility. So if they're stopping somewhere along the way, the 28-hour law does not apply. It also does not apply to air or sea travel. It also does not apply to international transport to Canada and Mexico, obviously with regard to chickens, but also with regard to pigs and ruminants other than cattle. There is an exception for cattle there, which we will talk about in a moment. So this law is it seems like to me, it would be pretty easy to comply with. 28 hours is a long time, but there are exceptions. So if you don't want to comply, you can apply for an exception and extend your transport even longer without giving these animals any kind of break. And these are the main exceptions. Although one wonders what the value of the exceptions are because enforcement is virtually non-existent and the penalties are extremely minimal. If you violate the 28-hour law and someone actually penalizes you for it, the minimum fine is $100 with a maximum fine of $500. That's $500 per occurrence, or a violation is per occurrence. An occurrence is truckload of animals. So it's not per animal, it's per truckload of animals. And when you think about the fact that a lot of times the companies who are sort of facilitating these transportation mechanisms are these multi-million-dollar companies, do you think they're going to worry about, they're going to jeopardize their schedule getting to where they're going to fulfill that contract because of a potential for a small chance of a $500 fine? Probably not. So if they violate it, they are supposed to be reported to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is supposed to bring a civil action to collect the penalty. When a violation is acknowledged, usually it just amounts to a company getting a letter saying, we know you violated this. They say, okay, we won't do it again. And then that's that. That's true even if it's the third, fourth, fifth offense, it doesn't matter. With regard to enforcement, there are 3 federal agencies that are technically tasked with enforcement duties under the 28-hour law: the DOJ, the DOT, and the USDA. The DOJ and the DOT really have done nothing to get involved with regard to enforcement of this law. In fact, they have not even promulgated specific regulations around enforcement. The USDA has taken some ownership of this, and in 1963, they enacted the Statement of Policy under the 28-hour law. This kind of outlines what food, water, and rest should look like. But keep in mind, this was 1963, so they were probably largely talking about rail carriers. And obviously, truck transport is a very different thing. So clearly, this statement needs to be updated. But like I said, the USDA has taken some ownership of this, and their division APHIS, and within APHIS, their veterinary services program, is actually who you would go to if there was some violation of the 28-hour law. Just to kind of illustrate the lack of enforcement of this law, here is a great study that was put out by the Animal Welfare Institute. In 2006 to 2019, there were 11 investigations of violations reported to APHIS around truck transport in the 28-hour law. Of those, just 6 were determined to be violations, which as a law, that should have been reported to the DOJ. However, the USDA only submitted 1 of those violations. So for almost 13 years, there was 1 violation submitted of the 28-hour law. As I said earlier, the 28-hour law only applies to domestic travel. So if there's international exportation of animals, that's addressed in another law in the US, and it includes handling and care of animals during the voyage. All those exported by air or sea are supposed to have a visual inspection of the veterinary services program 48 hours before the trip. And if they're determined unfit to travel under the World Organization for Animal Health Fitness to Travel standards, they're not supposed to travel. The US adopted these standards in 2016, which is a positive step forward, but the enforcement really isn't that great. So it hasn't done a whole lot to help the situation. When traveling involves Canada or Mexico, veterinary services does not have import and export protocols for pigs and ruminants other than cattle, and certainly not chickens or other birds, and does not address the 28-hour law. However, there is an exception to that. And I feel like this exception is illustrative of the whole sort of problem we have with these federal laws that we deem animal protection laws. Under this rule, the only animal transport that has this protection is cattle. And it is not because the government likes cattle better and wants to see them treated properly. It is because long transport times have been tied to mad cow disease. And they don't want mad cow disease, understandably, for human health reasons and also marketability. So transporters do not want to bring the cows to the slaughter facility only to find out that they are sick and diseased and they can't make money. So that is the reason for this exception. That is the whole point. It has nothing to do with animal welfare. Animal welfare is sort of like a side effect, almost an accident of these laws that are trying to get to something else, have a different mission. So any shipment of pigs or ruminants other than cattle coming from Canada and Mexico are instructed to go directly to the slaughter location, no matter how long the journey is. With cattle, again, they are supposed to follow the 28-hour law, and a stop is supposed to be made at the USDA approved food, water, and rest station. There are 5 in the country. They're pretty spread out. So I'm thinking they still have a long journey ahead of them, even if they do stop. So we're going to go north a little bit to Canada. And approximately 700 million farm animals are transported in Canada every year. 1.5 million approximately die en route each year, and many more are sick or injured as a result of the travel. The governing law in Canada for this is the Health of Animals Regulations, which does look at whether or not animals are fit for transport or unfit for transport. You can see sort of some examples of meeting either of those categories. And if an animal is deemed unfit for transport, they're supposed to be offloaded or isolated or treated by a veterinarian or euthanized, but not in with everybody else. But this does not happen with any regularity. So here are the duration times in Canada. And while these times for travel, and while these times look pretty long, it is an improvement. In 2019, Canada actually improved this standard and shortened these times. It went into effect in 2020. So this is a step forward, so that's good. Another plus for Canada over the US is that they do address chickens in their law, and we do not. The US does not. So that's another positive for Canada. The one that I find most concerning on here is the 12 hours for compromised animals, particularly calves, or for example, calves for 8 days or younger. I just can't imagine a calf 8 days or younger having no food, water, and rest for 12 hours. In 2001, the National Farm Animal Care Council developed a code of practice for transportation that's supposed to outline sort of higher welfare recommendations. And that has been in review for 20 years. And the other thing to note about codes of practice in Canada is they're only recommendations. So technically no one really has to follow it anyway. With regard to enforcement in Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is sort of tasked with enforcing this issue, and the Health of Animals regulation has some pretty stringent animal abuse crime penalties, such as a fine of $250,000 and jail time. But the Administrative Monetary Penalties Act actually allows the Minister of Agriculture to kind of impose their own alternatives and penalties with regard to farm animal transport. So you can see below, these are sort of the 3 main categories, and next to it is the maximum fine. So still better than the US's $500 per occurrence fine, but still leaves a lot to be desired. And again, enforcement is very poor. So now we're going to go down south to Mexico. And I think Mexico's particularly important because Mexico has a higher than average dependency on animal products. On average, Mexico slaughters approximately 14.8 terrestrial animals per person per year, and the global average is 10.1. So that's pretty significant. And Mexico is also a major exporter of live animals, and that's only continuing to grow. So transport's a really, really relevant issue there. So the humanitarian treatment and animal mobilization is the governing law around farm animal transport in Mexico. And you can see here the guidelines. I think in particular, it's interesting that they're so specific. In the US, it's 28 and 5. If an animal qualifies at all, it's 28 and 5 and that's it. Here, even the rest periods vary by animal. So that's kind of interesting. And again, Mexico does address chickens and hens in their law. Some states in Mexico have even gone beyond these federal guidelines and sort of create their own or add to them for higher welfare, such as Durango, which provides transport or prohibits transport in excessive temperatures. The US, some of the states in the US have sort of additional language around transport, but nothing that I've found that's super meaningful or substantial that would really change the face of transport in that state. And one thing that does happen in the US, which is interesting, is the industry has actually come forward with guidelines that exceed the 28-hour law, because even they're saying, you know what, these aren't good enough. And they're most likely saying it because their animals are showing up injured or diseased and then they can't sell them and that's a problem. But for whatever the reason, they're even acknowledging, hey, this 28-hour law just isn't enough. So that's kind of interesting. So enforcement in Mexico, the problem with the enforcement in Mexico, other than good old-fashioned enforcement, is the sanctions that are sort of available under this law are kind of limited. Any kind of harsher penalty has to result in, endangering the health status of the whole country or something like that. So for this purpose, if the law is enforced, they're looking at a fine, maybe brief suspension of services, things like that. But there's also a lot of self-policing in Mexico, so the threat of sanctions probably isn't that great. So just really quick, for purposes of comparison, just because it's such a huge difference, on the left here we have the general EU laws under farm animal transport, and on the right we have the US. And you'll notice that the EU laws are just, on paper at least, worlds better. So transport is only for 8 hours, followed by a 24-hour rest. That's even better than if the US had flip-flopped theirs. They do allow the transport of birds, so does Canada and Mexico. So the US definitely needs to catch up there. Includes sea transport. The US makes no mention of sea transport. Includes stocking density and headroom requirements. There's nothing like that in the US. If exceptions are met to extend travel, they have additional welfare requirements around temperature and things like that. Nothing like that in the US. If you get the exception, you get it, and that's that. And it applies to all transport that's in connection with an economic activity, even when they leave the EU. And obviously the US law only applies to domestic travel. So the EU is not without its problems, of course, like everyone else. They have enforcement issues. I think one of the biggest problems the EU has with enforcement is that the member states are tasked with sort of setting up what enforcement is going to look like in their particular country. And so that leaves like a great disparity among countries such as Denmark, who has really great compliance with their transport laws, and Italy, which is not so great. The other problem is there's a lot of like finger pointing. If you're going from Germany to Italy, Italy will say they thought Germany took care of the requirements. Germany will say they thought Italy did, and no one's doing it. And the other sort of big problem is sea transport. It's mentioned in the law, but it's not happening at all. These animals are traveling for days at a time and no one's enforcing this law. So what can we do about all of this? I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Some of the things we can think about are maybe ballot initiatives to create higher welfare requirements in specific states. We can talk about, I want to keep asking for birds to be included in all of these laws, because they are always getting left out, and that's the majority of the animals being farmed and slaughtered on land in the US, and that needs to change. So I think we never stop asking for that. Obviously, we need better enforcement. I mean, there's so much you can do there, and I think it's important to really bring awareness to this law, because public awareness is a really important tool as well that I think is underutilized. So definitely, learn all you can about it and get out and share it. I think that's one of the most important things we can do. And that is everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that compelling presentation. And for folks in the audience, please, again, if you have questions, which we'll attend to later, please submit them using the Q&A function. Next up, we have Rebecca Critser, who is a recent graduate of the Animal Law LLM program here at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she turned her commitment to raise the voices of non-human animals into her career. After obtaining a degree in animal behavior, Rebecca worked in biotech as a quality assurance manager, and during law school, she specialized in health law while obtaining her master in philosophy and bioethics. Currently, Rebecca chairs the Science and Technology Subcommittee and the Indiana State Bar Association Animal Law Committee. In our talk, Rebecca is going to touch upon how the use of animals in research has made headlines earlier this year when 3 monkeys escaped after a truck carrying approximately 100 monkeys crashed along Interstate 80. Sadly, these monkeys were captured and killed the following day. But while tragic, the story has somewhat of a silver lining. The airline Kenya Airways, which was responsible for bringing these monkeys into the US, announced that they would no longer transport live animals. Currently, all 3 countries within North America participate in live animal import and export for purposes of scientific research. And on this point, Rebecca will shed light on current laws within each. And our presentation will offer an overview of import-export requirements and the difficulty that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented, as well as strategic responses to them. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here. I will share my screen. Maybe. Can you see my title slide? No, let me try again. Can you see my title slide now? Wonderful, thanks. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the International Subcommittee for inviting me to talk today on U.S. animals in transit laws in science and research. I confess, due to our time constraints, I will probably focus primarily on the U.S. laws, and we will certainly touch base on that news article starting in 2021 and the implications for airlines and transport of animals and research. But to start off, there we go. A little bit about myself. The only thing I'm going to highlight is the last bullet point, and that I'm the proud human caretaker of my cat Cash and my dog Ender, and that if you would like to connect after this webinar presentation, I would be happy to do so, and that LinkedIn is the best way to contact me. I do need to give this disclaimer. I'm currently a fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Any views or opinions that I express here today are my own. They are not the views of the university, nor of the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So here is my roadmap for the presentation today. I am going to sort of recap those headlines we saw about a year and a half ago, dealing with the escaped monkeys on the Pennsylvania highway. I want to touch base on what laws apply in the US, and also specifically talk about and think about which agencies have jurisdiction in this arena. And then I'm going to circle back and give some context for the recent airline refusal to transport animals for the purposes of science and research. And I will conclude with 2 questions that I have been thinking about and that I invite you to join me in thinking about. But I will give a little bit of spoilers and that I don't have answers for you today, and that hopefully answers will emerge over the coming months and years. So to begin, perhaps you are familiar with headlines such as this: in January of 2021, 3 monkeys that escaped were captured after Pennsylvania crash have been euthanized. We're going to ignore the erroneous use of commas in this title and look to other similar headlines. This is from France 24, lab monkeys escape after US road crash, 1 on the loose, and an identical headline, but from the Times of India. And I show all 3 of these just to highlight that this was an international incident. So it had made headlines across the globe that these monkeys had escaped this truck that was on its way from JFK to Florida to be essentially quarantined after their transport. And while this was a very memorable headline, what really caught my attention personally and sort of drew me into this topic more deeply were the headlines that followed about a month later. So then we saw headlines such as airline vows to stop US lab monkey shipments after primates involved in highway crash from the Washington Post, as well as, quote, horrified airline vows to stop shipping lab monkeys like those involved in the Pennsylvania truck crash from the Philly Voice. And so this is, of course, referring to Kenya Airways, as Raj mentioned, and their decision after this incident to no longer transport animals for research purposes. And so this is what got me interested in this topic, and this is what I think is of particular interest in this current world order. But before we dive deeper into that, I want to step back a moment and just have a foundational understanding of what the laws are here in the US when we're talking about the transport of animals in science and research. So of course, wherever we're talking about animals, we always want to think about the Animal Welfare Act, which does in fact specifically call out as one of its objectives, quote, to assure the humane treatment of animals during transportation and commerce. This is taken directly from the USDA website. Additionally, when we're talking about animals in science, we always have to think about the Public Health Service Policy, or the PHS policy. We don't get a ton of guidance from this document as it primarily refers us back to the AWA, but we do have this language about, quote, and other applicable federal laws, guidelines, and policies, which is where we are able to pull in the guidelines and the third-party standards listed on the right-hand column. So the guidelines for the humane transport of research animal is where the majority of the specific requirements come from for transporting animals for science and research purposes. Of course, the well-known Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, which has been around for a while now in its 11th edition, also gives us some parameters that we must work within. And then finally, I've listed here the Live Animals Regulations by IATA. It's not a guideline in the standard sense. It's actually a voluntary third-party standard, but if a commercial airline that I am familiar with has agreed to voluntarily comply with these standards, so they are practically in effect. Now, I've sort of hinted at the fact that this is very complex, and these are certainly not all the laws that are involved. In fact, this is, quote, just the beginning. And to give you a sense of how large this scope is, I've just listed here some additional agencies that are involved in this space. So we've mentioned the USDA and IATA. We, of course, also have to think about the Department of Transportation, the CDC, the FDA, OLA. I don't know how I forgot to mention them on this logo. They are, of course, involved in the enforcement of the PHS policy. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, which primarily come into play when we're talking about the Endangered Species Act or when implications of CITES. And so while I'm not going to speak to the individual requirements from each of these agencies whose jurisdiction applies based upon the type of animal you're transporting and factors such as whether or not there are zoonotic diseases involved, and provided you a list, a non-comprehensive list of some of the criteria that are required by these laws and regulations for consideration when transporting animals in science. So of course, terrestrial versus aquatic animals, we have to think about, obviously, they have different environmental needs. Environmental controls of the animals are critical when thinking about transport. Are there zoonotic diseases involved? Do we have to consider the potential spread or hopefully containment of those? Importantly, for those on the science side of things, the implications of stress during transport is known to potentially impact the quality of the, quote, animal model, which can then negatively impact the quality of the data that anybody obtains from using these animals in research. You also have personnel training, PPE or personal protective equipment, both transport prep and post-transport assessment. So preparing the animals for the transport to come, preparing the vehicle itself, and then of course, at the other end of it, assessing the welfare of the animals who have gone through this transport process. Also things such as decontaminating between shipments. The mode of transportation becomes very relevant. So one example of this is if you travel by air, it is much faster than traveling by ground or by boat. But if you do have zoonotic diseases involved, traveling by air has a greater risk of contamination to consider. Interestingly, we don't see a lot of discussion of the transport of animals by sea when it comes to transport of animals for science purposes. And then you have your critical welfare considerations that you often see, such as access to food and water, physical space, and species-specific requirements. I will just say, there are a number of species-specific requirements for non-humans, for dogs, for cats, for rabbits, for additional animals that I'm forgetting, and they're not a short list of requirements. They are pages long. And then, finally, the number of subcontractors involved implicates the communication and the need for greater oversight. So you can see I just spent a few minutes sort of elaborating on this list. It's not all inclusive. The number of factors that go into this is extensive. Now, having laid a little bit of that foundation, I want to take us back to the headline we talked about, where Kenya Airways refused to continue to transport animals for research. And so interestingly, what I found was that they were not the first to do this. They're actually a little bit late to the party. Since the early 2000s, airlines have refused to transport animals for research purposes. There was some conflicting information on this front, but I believe it was British Airways in 2005 that first refused to transport animals for research purposes. I don't have it listed here, but in 2013, United Airlines joined British Airways. And then interestingly, in 2018, the National Association of Biomedical Research, known as NABR, filed a complaint with the Department of Transportation. For those of us on the animal activist side of things, the good news is that as of August 2022, the DOT has made no ruling on this complaint. So as of today, airlines are still permitted to make their own policies about whether or not they will transport animals for science purposes. And you see some variation of airlines making complete prohibitions and some only prohibiting non-human primates. And so I made this slide here just to highlight the four in the middle: the Qatar, China Southern, British Airways, and United Airlines were the subject of the DOT complaint. Kenya Airways, obviously important because of the 2021 headline article. But Air France, interestingly, just this year, maybe a month or two ago, announced that they would no longer transport non-human primates. Now, that's not all animals for research, but it is non-human primates for research. And one of the really important parts here is they were the last commercial airline to transport non-human primates into the United States. So it has major implications for the use of non-human primates in research in the US. The number of airlines who have refused to transport animals for research is much longer than this list. In fact, the DOT or the NABR complaint in the DOT is available online. It lists about 24 or so airlines that have some exclusion or a complete prohibition. So finally, I just want to touch base on some of the questions I've been thinking about on this topic. First of all, do we think that this is legally sound, that airlines can refuse to transport animals for research purposes, especially in the context that airlines still transport animals for zoos? Additionally, airlines still transport animals for service animals. Now, I think transportation for zoos is perhaps more analogous to what we're currently talking about, but I raised the issue of service animals because the DOT just issued a final ruling on this, and so it's currently in the news and being discussed. Additionally, I do think we would be remiss not to try to address the question of what about the research? The scientists who are pushing for airlines to transport these animals for their work say that the airlines are holding up medical advances, are causing public health risks. And it's easy sometimes for those of us who are very passionate about the animals to dismiss that. But I think to have an effective argument, we should address this question. And so some of the answers I've seen range from scientists actually being invited to do research on site. And what I mean by on site is that there is an island where many, maybe not most, but many of the monkeys raised for research purposes are housed and raised. And so US scientists have been invited to actually go to that island to do their research. And I chuckle a little bit only because I'm not sure how practical that is for the average scientist to uproot the research. But that has been one offer extended. They've also talked about the use of ground transportation. Certainly that's something to be considered within the United States and the continent. However, it's not as easy to use ground transportation if you're moving from Africa to the United States, as an example. I mentioned briefly that transport by sea is not very popular or not very much discussed in this space. And I don't know, but I speculate that's because the amount of time it would take and the stress implications and the degradation, again, essentially of the quote, quality of the animal model. Now, of course, the third option that I would like to promote is, of course, switching from the use of animal models to the use of non-animal models, to these alternatives. There are an increasing number of alternatives to animal models every year at a minimum. The federal government actually keeps a list of the options on their website that are readily accessible. And so I would hope to open doors to discussions about, rather than forcing airlines to transport these animals for research purposes, looking to what alternatives we already have here in the US that are available to us. And with that, I will say thank you. You can reach me at this email, and I look forward to your questions after Hannah's presentation.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Finally, we have Hanna Tereshko, who's joining us from Ukraine. Having begun her career as a corporate attorney, Hanna has been a volunteer and leader in the animal protection movement for over a decade and is currently pursuing her LLM online at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark, and is set to become the first Ukrainian attorney to specialize in animal law. She's a founder of the NGO Animal Justice and later stepped into the role of CEO of Open Cages Ukraine, which is an NGO dedicated to farmed animal protection. Since the start of the war, Hanna has continued to help animals in new circumstances, raising funds for animal shelters in her home country. And more recently, she's devoted her time towards a mobile clinic project to enable veterinarians to travel to occupied cities and villages in order to provide medical aid. In our talk today, Hanna will shed light on three major efforts to rescue animals since the start of the war. The first is transport, in which she'll discuss the differences between owners and shelter operators seeking to evacuate pets. From here, she'll speak to the inherent difficulties in evacuating animals from active combat areas. And finally, she'll touch upon some bureaucratic issues like vaccinations and documentation that have proved to be hurdles when refugees attempting to cross the border with animals, and other reasons why so many animals have been left behind, as well as how some of these hurdles have been overcome to save their beloved animals. Hanna, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you. So I will share my screen. Okay. Is it visible? Okay, today I will tell a little bit about the transportation of animals in Ukraine, and after that a little bit about the evacuation. Generally speaking, Ukrainian society is quite concerned about the well-being and welfare of farmed animals, and even business tries to somehow correspond to these needs of society. For example, here you can see the screen of the website of one of the biggest and one of the most famous Ukrainian farmed business MHP company, which claims that they treat animals with due care and including during the transportation. But is it really the case in reality? So if to talk about the legislation, Ukraine is pretty developed in terms of legislation about animal conditions during the transportation. We have a decree on the approval of the rules for the transportation of animals, and this decree establishes some rules about the conditions of the animal during the trip. So, for example, animals shall be fed each 24 hours and watered every 12 hours. The vehicles shall be equipped in a way to protect animals from any harm, any external influences, provide ventilation, and etc. Animals which are injured or cannot move by themselves, they cannot be transported. And even the vehicle shall be equipped with the special warning system, so the driver can track whether the temperature is going to maximum or the minimum. And there are also rules with regard to veterinary care. So if the animals are injured, they should be provided with the medical help. And if the transport goes with the animals which number exceeds 200, there should be obligatory veterinary doctor who accompany these animals. So there are a lot of great rules, but does it really works in reality? According to the same decree, there shall be the veterinary doctor who shall check and examine these rules application on practice. So where and when does this veterinary appear? If to start from the very beginning, we have the State Service of Ukraine on food safety and consumer protection. So if to analyze even the name of this service, you see that it's quite anthropocentric. So it deals mostly with human needs rather than animal welfare. But still, exactly this service controls the animal health and animal welfare. And how they do this? This state service conduct control through local representative offices of this state service and state veterinary inspectors. Exactly, the state veterinary inspectors are like central figures in whole this process. So they start examining the vehicle and the animals at the very beginning of the trip. So before the animals are loaded to the truck or to the vehicle. And they should check the veterinary documents like the passport, veterinary certificate, and they shall check the animals themselves, whether animals are suitable to be transported. And here we already see the problem that they mostly check the animals on the beginning of the trip, but after the trip has started, people who are responsible for animals are the driver and the person who accompany the animals on behalf of the sender of the animals or the owner of these animals. So we already understand that these people cannot be impartial. When this veterinary doctor appears again, during the trip, there might be some like the checkpoints where the truck will stop and the veterinary doctor will appear again at this checkpoint and examine the conditions of the animals and define the further trip of this vehicle. The problem here, firstly, it is not enough to effectively check and examine the animal conditions just during the stop at these checkpoints. For example, the veterinary doctor can check what are conditions, whether animals are alive, whether they are injured or not. But is it possible for this inspector to check what was the temperature during the whole trip? Or whether animals were fed enough or watered enough. This is something which is like kind of a problem. The second issue is that we do not have exactly animal welfare inspector. This state veterinary inspector, he or she mostly cares about the human health, whether the documents are completed appropriately and not to spread the diseases and etc. So this is not something about animals themselves. This is more about the human needs. And even if this state veterinary inspector sees some really clear, visible violations, there are some authorities of this person. So this inspector can draft reports about the violations or can issue some orders to stop the violation and check its execution, or for example restrict or ban export, or involve some enforcement authorities like the police office. For example, if there is mass death of animals during the trip, the veterinary inspector will record this fact and involve the police, and the police will start investigation based on the information received from this inspector. So there are some authorities, but it is really difficult to make how the process works in reality. And another big issue is the punishment. We have both administrative and criminal responsibility. Administrative responsibility for the violation of the rules of transportation apply when there were no death or serious injuries for the animal, but there will be only the fine, and it's ridiculous. It's less than $100 US, so it's like nothing for business. If to talk about criminal responsibility, it is also possible for the violation of the rules of transportation, but only if there were really serious consequences like injuries, mutilations. And again, there should be police investigation first, and in reality, it might be difficult to prove the connection between, for example, the death of the animal and the conditions of the trip. So it might be not so clear, the connection between this. This anthropocentric is really the great issue, because the whole system is focused on the work how to avoid spread of disease and how to provide the biggest commercial property rather than on the animals themselves. But fortunately, Ukraine is moving on to the more like animal welfare approach, because we have the new law on the veterinary medicine, and exactly this law provides some more detailed rules with regards to the animal examination. So, for example, right now, inspector mostly conducts some visual inspection. But after this new law on veterinary medicine, the inspector shall, for example, monitor the temperature of the animal, or shall examine the conditions of the whole trip during the whole time of this trip. Check whether there are appropriate conditions of the feeding of the animals, etc. So the rules are more detailed. But the problem is that this new law will enter into force only 1 year after the end of the state of martial law in Ukraine. So 1 year after the war ends. So no one actually knows where it might happen. And a little bit about the evacuation really quickly, because I think I don't have very much time. After the 24th of February, we have total chaos in many spheres and in animal welfare in particular. And when talking about this, I can say that war influenced everybody, not only the human, but animals like pets, like bigger animals, like farmed animals. Here you can see the local painter from Bucha. This man is Igor Prokofiev, and he has been in the occupation 33 days. And here are his paintings in the local gallery. So he said that one of the saddest pictures were the pictures of pets left by their owners. But not only the pets suffered, but also the farmed animals. They suffered because of the shelling. They suffered because of the lack of care, because a lot of people left the territories, and it's simply not enough people to care about these animals, to feed them, and etc. And what were the biggest problems? Here you can see the information and this article about the 4 million chickens died because of the war. So what were like the biggest issue with evacuation? Issue with the transport, to find the transport. Issue with the transport to the occupied cities or cities where the the greatest and the hottest combat actions are taking place. Issue of bureaucracy, because in Ukraine, there is no authority which deals with evacuation of animals. So the state is completely outside this process. If you want to evacuate shelter or your own pet, it's up to you, it's up to volunteer and human owners. And finally, the legal status of animals abroad. Because I personally know people, volunteers who evacuated their shelters, at least partially, and now their animals got lost and they cannot find them. And finally, in July, the old rules of crossing the border started to work again. So, for example, if in the March or April it was quite easy to cross the border without documents, now the full package of documents is necessary again. So in order to transfer at least one animal, you need passport, chip, vaccination, test on rabies, and special Form 1, which is issued by the veterinary doctor and valid only for 3 days. It's firstly financial issue and issue of time and like issue of bureaucracy. And it's possibly if you have one animal, but what if you need to evacuate a shelter with 100 animals? Here on the right screen, you can see the comment in social media where people actually write about these problems, that they will probably stay in Kharkiv, which is massively bombed by Russians, with their stray animals. They are feeding simply because they do not have enough money to pay for all these procedures to evacuate all these animals. So there are a lot of issues, but the good news is that there are a lot of initiatives who are dealing with evacuation right now and help to save animals, even from the hottest regions. So thank you for opportunity. Thank you for presentation.
Thank you so much, Hanna, for that engaging presentation. And for those in the audience, if you have questions, again, please feel free to send them through the Q&A. Touching upon the first one that's come in, this is for Cynthia. So what about getting some of the more progressive grocery stores like Wegmans, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's to help with raising awareness across US among people who shop at those stores? Would this be a way to get these stores to work harder to source their meat products from producers who take steps to treat their animals more humanely?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's a great question. There's a lot of work with corporate engagement, and it can be a really powerful tool. I think, those companies are driven by the consumer wanting to shop there, right? So if you don't want to shop there, you make your voice heard that you don't agree with something that's going on that they're enabling or participating in. I think that can be really valuable. So at this point, I don't think they have a whole lot of options with higher welfare. Some of the industry does have higher standards, which I guess is technically higher welfare. I think most animal advocates would not think it counts as welfare, but it's improvement, it's something. So yeah, definitely it's great to talk to those stores that you really care about and that are generally tend to be more socially progressive, who may be motivated by that and really want to try to do something about, better welfare for the animals that are transported under their store.
And maybe if I could follow up that question with another, Cynthia, there's a Supreme Court case going on right now implicating the Dormant Commerce Clause, where California is trying to allow for only higher animal welfare products to be sold within its borders, and then other states potentially are pork producers complaining about that. And I'm wondering, with respect to international transport rules, could a state like California require better animal transport provisions to be followed from Canada or from Mexico, or is the 28-hour law, preemptive of anything like that?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think that they would preempt something that had a higher standard. I think that would probably be, they would have a lot to go through to get to that point, but I can't think that the 28-hour law would necessarily preempt something like that.
Okay, great, thank you. This question is from Vanessa. Hannah, do you know if vets verify if these animals are potentially pregnant during this inspection? And the reason that Vanessa is asking is because there are rules that prohibit transportation of animals during the last months of gestation, but whether these rules are observed in practice is another question altogether.
Yes, it is prohibited, but it depends on the term. If to talk about this decree I have been talking about at the very beginning of my presentation, it is prohibited to transport animals at the last term, the last weeks or the last months of the term. Yes, the veterinary inspector shall check this issue before animals are loaded, but how it works in practice, I cannot say that it is 100% guarantee. It should be in the documents like veterinary certificate. So this is how it should be, but what's in reality, I cannot say that definitely if the animal is pregnant, it cannot be transported. So in reality, there might be violations.
Okay, thank you so much. This question is for Rebecca. You spoke to some initial airlines refusing to transport animals for research purposes back in 2005. Do you have a sense of why airlines started to do this? Was it due to animals potentially being killed during transport, insurance questions, passenger or public concerns?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. So there's a couple of different reasons that have been given. I think most recently, you see airlines speaking to their social responsibility policy and being in touch maybe with the public's feelings towards use of animals in research. But it's certainly also the case that transporting animals for research has an additional cost and oversight. When you think about personnel training and the equipment you have to transport these animals. And so I think it's both a combination of sort of a bottom line economics and also wanting to be perceived maybe in a good light and have a selling point to their socially conscious consumers.
Okay, and if I might follow that up with the question of, if we see a lot of airlines refusing or changing their policies, whether due to sort of social consciousness issues, does that, or have you seen that there's an increase in on the ground sort of breeding facilities? So if we can't import them from abroad, then we'll just, breed them here at home.
Yeah, so the major concern comes in with primates, non-human primates, right? Certainly we have a lot of breeding facilities for other animals used in research. And there have been discussions about that. I mean, China certainly started looking into those options within their own country, and people in the US have talked about doing that as well. I haven't seen any action beyond talk. But again, one of the things that's difficult about this space is that it's often not very transparent and things happen behind the scenes. So it's definitely something we would be looking out for. It's definitely a possibility, but not something I've seen active movement on.
Okay, thank you. This question is for you, Hannah. Comes from here at Jaleel. I wonder if you know about zoo animals in Ukraine and whether there have been initiatives to relocate them to either sanctuaries or zoos abroad, or even repatriate exotic animals to their home countries. Is there a legal procedure that allows for this?
With regard to repatriate exotic animals to their homeland, I'm not sure I can tell about this right now. I didn't hear about this. But with regard to the evacuation, I know about a few attempts of volunteers to evacuate private zoos from the Kiev, north of the Kiev, to some more safer regions. I didn't prepare this information. I can actually find the information, how was it called, and send, but I will send to Hira, right?
Thank you. And this question is also for you, Hannah. The Ukrainian surveillance system is similar to the system used by the Brazilian government. Recently, the meat industry is lobbying Congress to change legislation to create a kind of self-regulation within the meat industry. Is there any kind of movement in Ukraine to weaken government control over animal welfare inspection? So that's with respect to Ukraine, and if you know other countries as well.
It's possible to say that there are some steps, because right now there are two inspections which can be made to the farming facilities, planned and unplanned. And right now there is a moratorium on the unplanned inspections. So we can talk about some kind of more freedom for businesses. But on the other hand, we have more requirements according to the new law on the veterinary medicine. So there are like both pros and cons if to talk about this.
Okay, and then we have one final question also for you, Hanna. So the war has definitely made a difficult situation even worse for animals there in your home country. And what can folks in the audience do to help with the situation for animals in Ukraine?
Thank you for this question. There are a lot of issues, and there are a lot of ways how I know volunteers from abroad helped Ukraine, not only in terms of fundraising, but also with regard to help to evacuate animals. You know, all these bureaucracy issues. If you want to evacuate animal, you need to know firstly where. The main question, where will the animal be situated? So I think how the local volunteers from, for example, the European countries can help, and they actually did this. They helped to evacuate Ukrainian animals to the shelters of the Europe, and resolve all the bureaucracy issues on this way. Also, I think it's really important to you know, not to forget about the situation, and to again try to write some comments in social media, try to not to forget about this topic on the presentation, and etc. And also I'm not sure how can this possibly be done by someone else outside Ukraine. I'm right now, for example, try to list all the news I see with regard to situation, and just calculate at least approximately how much animals are killed, because the government is calculating the number of military killed, civilians killed, but no one actually think about the situation with animals. We have 4 million chickens dead on only one farm, but we have many farms destroyed. We have many mini zoos destroyed. We have shelters destroyed. And if to calculate, I already have really a lot, the great number of these animals. So maybe it would be great if someone who are seeing some news in their countries, because you know I cannot track all this. I can track this in my information bubble, but maybe you can share. Probably someone did some analysis already, so it would be great. It's like an informational help.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, Cynthia, and Hanna, for these amazing presentations. And thank you everyone for attending this event. We look forward to more fruitful and ongoing conversations down the road. Thank you so much.